Everything's changing in PR these days, so now what? Businesses are sitting on blogs, newsletters, podcasts, and LinkedIn pages, but without a cohesive strategy, their owned content risks just becoming noise. Today, we're breaking down exactly where PR agencies fit into the owned content equation and why the smartest brands are leaning on their PR partners for more than just press hits, and what this actually looks like when PR-led content strategy gets it right. Michelle, great to chat with you today. I'm excited for this conversation on the changing role of PR and owned content.
Yeah, this is going to be a fun one. I'm looking forward to it.
I think it's no secret, like everybody in the industry is talking about how AI and GEO is changing how it is we do things, right? And what that means for different types of content, what moves the needle, where brands need to be showing up in order to be surfaced in these LLM, results. And so I'm looking forward to getting into this conversation about kind of where owned content fits into this equation. We've talked a lot about how earned media, has taken on this renewed importance because, those are frequently cited sources in LLM results. Now owned content is also becoming a big piece of that equation. And so I think it's an interesting discussion about kind of as a vendor, as a PR agency partner vendor role, right? How much should we be getting involved in a client or a brand's owned content strategy? How those two things kind of work together. And so there's a lot of change that's happening. Some of the lessons that we'll get into are kind of, no duh. Fundamentals haven't changed, but the way that we think about kind of putting all these pieces together is changing a lot. I think there's a lot to get into.
Yeah, I definitely think if you don't have your PR team involved in this strategy, complementing your earned media, then you're sort of missing the mark. So looking forward to diving into this discussion today and talk about, what stayed the same and what's changing. And there's some fun stuff to dig into here.
Yeah. So let's start by kind of looking at what the old model of owned content kind of was and is and where that's shifting, kind of its new importance. So there's been a lot of recent studies about kind of how owned content gets surfaced into LLM results. And there's a recent report from Penta Group that said that 60% of cited material in LLMs comes from corporate owned or business produced sources. So we're talking about website pages, right? Blogs, LinkedIn posts, case studies, things like that. I think what's interesting in my experience, right? A lot of clients kind of treat that stuff as like boxes to check, right? Assets to have to help, audiences, basically as reference material, right? For audiences to hopefully find interesting and get something out of it, right? And that model is now dead. The renewed importance of owned media, I think the biggest takeaway is that these brand assets, they can't be passive anymore. They can't be just like sitting on your website or sitting on your LinkedIn, just hoping that the right person will find it and interact with it, right? Now, these assets have to have a function and have to answer specific questions that your audiences are asking so that they show up in LLMs, but more to the point, like so that they are doing something to help your business move forward, right? It's great to have like a library of blog posts and case studies for people to interact with, but unless you are answering the specific questions to meet people where they are asking those questions, then they're kind of just sitting there hoping, waiting, right? And that kind of passive purpose is not serving brands, the way that they should these days. So I think that's kind of a big takeaway that is a little bit different in the way that we write that type of content.
Yeah, I definitely agree, especially right now when there is so much access to the data. We didn't have all this sales data before. We didn't have customer objections firsthand. They were often regurgitated in some way from salesperson to salesperson back to the marketing team. Now we have so much access to, like you pointed out before, like what are the questions are the customers? What are they wanting us to answer? So instead of blogs just being a marketing checkbox or, a newsletter being a marketing checkbox, like you said, it's definitely a communication tool that needs to map to a bigger business strategy. And I think, thanks to the LLMs and the way they're prioritizing information, we get to see a shift into how we use those tools from a PR, marketing, and overall communication strategy.
It's not to say that earned media is not important, because it absolutely is still, right? But the way that we think about feeding kind of the AI machine, right? The news cycle is so fast these days. Things change. There's new announcements every day, and so the life cycle of the earned media hit that you get, it's got a great value kind of immediately, and it helps feed the machine from that kind of recency standpoint. And it's great for credibility building and all of that. But like that story has a short life cycle and things move on. So that value kind of fades over time. Whereas with owned media, those things compound over time with AI, right? And so as long as, and we'll get into kind of best practices about how to write compelling owned media content, but those owned assets, when you write them consistently and they have a clear point of view, a clear voice, a clear kind of purpose, right? And you're consistent about repetitively bringing that to your content, that stuff compounds over time. It helps further train those models. This brand stands for this, and they solve this problem. And that earned media thing is great as a pop, but it doesn't have the shelf life, right, as some of this own content does.
I always think of earned media as quick hit and move on to the next quick hit. I was thinking about this yesterday, that our owned content gives us an opportunity to extend the life of that earned media, right? Because let's imagine you get that hit, and so often I see companies that we work with, okay, great, we got a hit, cool. And, maybe they socialize it or something like that. Instead of giving more life to it, support that media hit with a blog post. Of course, socialize it, but make sure also that your sales team understands, hey, we got this hit. Here's a way to position it to your prospects. Again, giving more life and longevity to that earned media with your owned media, I think is also an important part of that strategy as well.
100%. A good marketing program really excels when those two things are married, right? I love your point about bringing a blog post to support your earned media efforts. I think that's really great. And it gets to this idea of consistency. And I think, we've learned, or we've talked about how being consistent in what it is you say is really important, right? So that your market and your audience understands exactly who you are, how you differentiate from competitors, right? And the problems that you're solving. But it also helps train those models. It takes the guessing game out of the equation, right? Like if you're consistently saying the same thing, the models figure it out. They know who you are and what you stand for, and they don't try to make it up and fill in the cracks, right? So consistency is really important. And I think this is another kind of key topic to dive into is, we talk a lot about you got to feed the machine, right? More. Being consistent, right? To me, consistency means it's less of a measure of quantity and frequency and more a measure of like, are you saying the same thing over and over, right? Are you really, really clear in what it is that you're trying to do or trying to solve, right? I think people kind of conflate consistency as like, we got to do 2 blog posts a day, right? Or we got to get a new page up on the website. We got to get a new case study. And it's good to like have that mindset to be creating new assets, but it's not a question of speed in my mind or like how much can we get out the door, right? Consistency to me is much more about like, what's the content? Is it the same, right? Do we kind of say the same messaging that matters to our audiences, right? That are going to help move our business forward. That's a big one right now.
I'm glad you brought that up. I don't want to upset our friends in the SEO side of the business, but definitely that is the counsel folks are giving right now when they are trying to optimize for SEO and or generative engine optimization, because these LLMs are prioritizing that. So there is 2 blog posts a day. And we just know you can't get the quality of writing and messaging in 2 blog posts a day. And I understand the strategy and I'm not even against it. So, maybe if that's what SEO is going to do, and for now it's going to take over the blog, we pivot to something else, right? There has to be a spot on the website. There has to be a place in your earned media where you're being authentic and you're delivering messaging that is not just all about quantity for the sake of SEO, GEO. We all know why we do it, but I think that's why we're leaning into earned media as an overarching strategy that affects your social, that affects the collateral you produce, that affects, the content on the website. Maybe in addition to a blog, you add an additional section like insights or interviews with execs. If you're going to use the blog for that tool for an SEO reason, then you're going to need another section that leads into the more authentic content that maps to
Yeah.
your overall marketing strategy.
Yeah, and the authenticity is a big piece of this, right? And I think that's where we come in, right? As an agency partner, is we are going to help bring our clients that kind of editorial discipline, right? That lens that, you know, if we leave the internal marketing teams to their own devices, right, they're going to fall into that pattern of like we got to rank high on Google, which is important, right? But like you can certainly fall into that trap of like trying to get too much out there, trying to answer too many questions. We talk about boiling the ocean. This type of audience, needs to hear this kind of thing, and this kind of audience needs to hear this kind of thing. And yes, it's true, you need to craft messages to meet each of those audiences' unique needs, but it can be a really like unwieldy kind of cumbersome process if you're trying to do too much in too many places, and that cohesive strategy that you're talking about can really go out the window. And so bringing in a partner like us who's going to help you with the earned media part, of course, because that's our bread and butter, right? But we can also bring that kind of editorial insight, like what is it that actually matters to these audiences, what is the type of messaging and key terms that we need to own, right? And help bring that in to kind of keep the earned and owned media strategies tethered, right? And I think that's where we're starting to see a lot of work with our clients. It's like, yes, help us pitch stories and get media coverage, right? So can you help me like make sure this blog post sounds right? Can you help me write this case study so that it shows up in a way that, says something to other prospects? And so I think that's kind of our changing role in this whole equation. I'm curious to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, especially buyers are just smarter than they used to be. So, they can see through the hype and they can see through the buzzwords and they can see through like all of a sudden they go into your blog and you've got 1 million posts a day. Like they can see through that. So where are you giving them the information that they need? And that needs to be part, like you said, a strategy. And that's where, the role of the PR agency has really been evolving quite a bit. And I think when you just take a step back and look at it as communications as a whole, then you realize that it all goes together. And that's where the agency can come in and help you define those narratives for a quarter, for a year, for whatever that time frame looks like that's most important for your business objectives, and then map those narratives and that strategy using earned, using owned, and bringing on board the internal team as well, right? That gets missed sometimes, that you need to communicate to your internal team the messages that you're spreading outside the organization so that everyone's on the same page. And that's really where your PR team comes in and brings that discipline.
Owned content is often some of the best stuff for creating earned content, right? Like we can take a blog post, turn it into a pitch, obviously, right? If the client has done some research and pulled some data together, right, we can turn that into a report and mold that data to best fit what it is reporters are looking for and what they want to cover, right? We can help make charts and graphs and things, kind of go beyond like, hey, this is a nice resource for people to find, to we take it outside and get people to cover it and get that third party kind of validations. The two really should work hand in hand, and I think people know that, right? But like it does take some intention and some strategy to really make it work well together.
I think that owned media is really important when you're at that early stage startup, right? Everyone comes in, they've got a great story to tell, they want that press hit. But if you're not known and if you haven't really stood for anything, you can't tell on the website who you are, your exec might not have had any speaking engagements or whatnot yet, that owned media is what builds that foundation to set the stage for future PR, for future earned pieces, right? So it's really an opportunity. Let's say you have a new founder and they really just need to start establishing their voice. Prioritizing owned media first, getting them, in different ways, right? A podcast or a webinar, so that when you are pitching them to another podcast or a speaking engagement, you can give an example of how charismatic they are or how they might come across on screen or on radio. I think that's especially important to our early stage startup friends.
Yeah, that's a great point. We know, like working with early stage startups, it's hard to get them covered, right, if they're not known. And so, yeah, really using what assets they do have from the owned perspective, molding those into material for earned coverage is definitely important. We see this every day, right? And then, once you get to a certain size, it's easier to kind of get that earned media, right? And that's when, again, the discipline goes back to, all right, let's make sure our owned media and what we're creating maps to what we're kind of broadcasting out on the earned side. So yeah, that's a great point. If I could step back for a second and just say kind of like what the big, I guess, overall takeaway that I'd want people to get from this is that, the brands that are really succeeding today in meeting kind of their audience's needs and asking or answering the right questions that those audiences are asking, they're not necessarily the ones with the most press coverage, right? They're not necessarily the loudest and most visible ones. The noise and the signal thing doesn't necessarily line up, right? It's the brands that are showing up consistently, saying something that matters to their audiences and doing it across each channel where those audiences exist, right? So your inbox, right? From an email marketing perspective, your LinkedIn feed, right? On your website, newsletters, things like that, right? Everything kind of is, if it's not cohesive, right? You're just kind of grasping at different straws. That consistency, again, like doesn't happen by accident. It's really important. You have to be intentional about it. Someone is building that, right? And it's easy for internal marketing teams to get really kind of overwhelmed with that, right? Because they're doing a million different things too, yeah. Right? They're certainly busy. So a PR agency can be really helpful in creating that structure, building content calendars, right? Looking for proactive opportunities that we can use our own content to kind of answer or address. Those kind of structural requirements are really, really important these days. And that's what we're really good at, is bringing structure to the chaos.
Yeah, you made me think of a client recently, a newer client that we've been onboarding at Sterling. And once you dig into a company, you start learning all their different nuances. This company is amazing at messaging. They've done just a stellar job throughout the organization of nailing that down, but they're not being consistent across their channels like we've discussed. So we as an agency were able to come on board and say, hey, there's that press release. Why didn't we turn that into some blog content? And, why don't we support that with a LinkedIn article that your CEO drafts, all supporting the same theme. And they're like, didn't really think about that, because you do just get sort of in your role, you get pulled in a million different directions as when you're working for, internally on a marketing team, and your agency can really just come in and give that, okay, let's step back. Let's make sure all these pieces are working together. You guys are doing an amazing job at this, but oh my gosh, what if we spread it across these different channels? And then they're like, oh, the light bulb goes off, and, then you're off and running with a really profound program.
Yeah, that tunnel vision is real, right? Like you can understand, like when you're building internally, you're building all this different product, you get focused on this one project, right? And then, all right, we got to ship that. All right, on to the next, right? And it's really hard to like just take a breath and look around and say, how is this serving our bigger mission, right? And that's that kind of outside counsel that we bring, that I think is really necessary these days, just because there's so much noise out there. Things are happening so fast. You just need like a guru, right? To kind of be like, hey, what are we doing here? How is it mapping to the bigger mission? You absolutely nailed it. That's really important.
It's like having a personal chef or something, right? Like I know all the right things I'm supposed to eat, but in reality, I just don't have time to make those. But if someone was over here guiding me and, preparing it and doing that for me, like, great, no problem. And I'm as healthy as ever. So I kind of think of it like that. What a journalist needs to put a story together, those foundational pieces should be easily accessible on a website. And I think when you don't have those in place, you're missing the mark as far as what the media are looking for.
Yeah. Well. And the bar to earned media is just harder too, or higher, right? Like you need a lot of elements in play to convince a journalist to cover you, right? Or your news, whatever it is, right? It used to be, earned media used to be a lot easier, 10 years ago, right? Like we could pitch a story and say, trust us, right? You don't need the third party validation. This company's building a cool thing and it's going to, save humanity or whatever. And they would be like, great, we can write that, because the whole startup thing, venture was like really hot, and it was like, all right, we'll ask questions later, right? That's not the case anymore. Earned media is hard, and it's still doable, but you need to have a lot of those elements to really convince a journalist, and those owned elements that we have the power and the control to create and kind of mold. Those ingredients really need to be in tip-top shape, right? And that's, again, something that we can bring our expertise to creating.
It puts the company in a power position because you are really owning your messages at that point. And then you're, like we talked about earlier, having that foundation in place to get the other stories out there. Or when, even investors are taking a look at you, it's a big thing too, especially for our early stage startup friends. That content needs to be on your website, and that content needs to not be slop, because yes, you can go to AI and have it whip out something for you that's probably pretty close to what you want to say, but there are nuances to how that content should be drafted. The trained eye knows how to recognize AI writing versus, something that's had a human touch on it. And I think that makes a really big difference right now as well in this world of just a lot of information, a lot of competition. So differentiating yourself with that quality and authenticity makes a big difference.
Something that we can help do as content specialists is kind of help blend those things so that whatever the strategy is for the company, right, that we're writing that content to fit that, each unique strategy there.
Yeah, I think we get lucky in that way because we do get to work with a lot of different companies across a lot of different industries. So we get to test what works. We get to see what other people are doing really well. And we get to actually bring that to our other clients. Hey, did you think about this? Did you want to try this? More so than you have that ability when you are, working with your internal team and you just don't have that insight across what other companies doing. And especially right now as everything is evolving and changing a bit, but it's evolving and changing and then it stays the same. It goes back to clear messaging and authenticity and credibility, and we can say that all the time, but that's what the buyer needs in order to make a decision.
Yeah, that's been a common theme throughout our series here with Now What, right? Is like the basics still matter, right? Like the way that content eventually makes it out to the public might change, or the reasons why you might put different things out to the public might change. But the way that you build your messaging framework, the way that you write, the way that you think about what problem am I solving? Does the audience care? Is this meeting their needs, right? All that has been evergreen for years and will continue to be. The basics still matter.